June 23, 1944, the humid air above New Guinea was already shimmering when the twin-engined Lightning slid into formation with the bombers. The pilot in the left cockpit was a major now, but he didn't look much different from the farm kid he'd been a few years earlier. Round face, easy smile, and a way of sitting in the seat that made the big fighter look almost casual under him. Officially, he wasn't there to hunt. His new posting said Advanced Gunnery Instructor on the paperwork. The orders from his superiors were even clearer. He could accompany missions, he could observe, he could bring back gun camera film and practical notes for training, but he was to defend himself only. No chasing contacts, no diving alone into a swarm of Japanese fighters, no adding to the tally that already made him the most famous pilot in the Pacific. But as the formation droned north toward enemy territory, Richard Ira, Dick Bong, knew himself too well. Somewhere out there would be Japanese aircraft Zeros, Oscars, twin-engine night fighters guarding the oil fields that kept Japan's war machine running. If they appeared, he also knew what would happen. It had happened on every tour so far, and before the year was out, despite those observe and instruct orders, he would bring his total of destroyed enemy aircraft to 40. To understand how a man ends up in that strange position, told to just take pictures and come home, yet unable to stop answering every challenge, you have to start a long way from New Guinea, on a small farm not far from the cold waters of Lake Superior. He was born in 1920 in Superior, Wisconsin, the oldest of 9 children in a family of Swedish immigrants. The Bongs worked hard land near the village of Poplar, where winters were brutal and money was scarce. Dick learned early how to milk cows, fix fences, and coax machinery back to life when buying new parts wasn't an option. It was the sort of practical upbringing that produced people who didn't panic easily and who measured danger against the day's chores rather than against abstract risk. From the moment airplanes started appearing over northern Wisconsin, he was hooked. Neighbors remembered the boy who would drop whatever he was doing and run outside whenever an aircraft engine echoed down the valley. He built model planes from scrap wood and wire, covered his walls with pictures from magazines, and devoured everything he could read about aviation. In 1938, he enrolled at Superior State Teachers College. Flying was still a dream, not a career path. But the world was changing. Germany and Japan were pushing outward. War in Europe and Asia was already a reality. When the US Army Air Corps expanded its aviation cadet program in 1941, Bong saw his chance. He enlisted, passed the exams, and entered pilot training just months before Pearl Harbor pulled the United States fully into the war. Army flight training in those years made quick decisions about young men. Some washed out, some became bomber pilots, some navigators or instructors. In Bong's case, instructors noticed something unusual almost immediately. He had that hard-to-define combination of hand-eye coordination, instinct and calm under pressure that marks a natural fighter pilot. He was aggressive in the air but not reckless on instruments, and he seemed to understand intuitively how an airplane spoke through the control column. He was also, like many 21-year-olds with new wings and a powerful machine under them, a bit of a show-off. In early 1942, based in Northern California, he joined a group of P-38 pilots who decided that the Bay Area's landmarks looked too tempting to ignore. On one day that later became legendary in squadron stories, P-38s were seen looping around the Golden Gate Bridge, thundering low over Market Street, and buzzing residential neighborhoods with enough enthusiasm to blow clothes off a woman's backyard clothesline. General George C. Kenney, then in charge of West Coast air defenses, was not amused. He personally reprimanded Bong for the antics and grounded him for a short time. If anything, the incident only cemented Kenney's memory of the young pilot. That would matter later, when the general needed aggressive men for the hardest theatre of the war. By January 1942, Bong had earned his pilot wings and a commission as a second lieutenant. The Army, recognizing his skill with gunnery, initially assigned him as an instructor at Luke Field in Arizona. For several months he taught others how to fire accurately from fighters, how to judge deflection and lead a moving target, how to rely on the sight instead of flinching at the vibration of the guns. It was valuable work, but Bong hadn't signed up to spend the war over the desert. That changed when he transferred to the 49th Fighter Squadron, 14th Fighter Group at Hamilton Field in California. There he met the aircraft that would define his life, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The P-38 didn't look like any other fighter of its time. Instead of a single fuselage and engine, it had twin booms joined by a central pod, where the pilot sat surrounded by guns. 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, all concentrated in the nose. 2 turbo-supercharged Allison engines drove large propellers rotating in opposite directions to counteract torque. The result was an aircraft with long-range, heavy firepower and outstanding performance at high altitude. It could climb fast, dive like a stone, and crucially for the Pacific fly far enough to escort bombers over great distances. The Lightning also demanded respect. It was heavier than the nimble, single-engine fighters most pilots knew. Managing 2 engines, complex cooling systems, and unfamiliar aerodynamics required discipline. Bong took to it immediately. He had a knack for reading how the big fighter wanted to be flown, how much power she would give, how hard she could be pulled through a turn, how to use the twin engines to roll and yaw in ways a Japanese pilot in a Zero could not easily follow. By mid-1942, the United States was shifting men and machines to the Southwest Pacific area, where General Douglas MacArthur was charged with halting Japanese expansion in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Kenny, now commanding the 5th Air Force under MacArthur, remembered the young P-38 pilot he had once grounded for showing off. That aggressive spirit was exactly what he believed the air war in the Pacific demanded. Bong was ordered to the 9th Fighter Squadron, the Flying Knights of the 49th Fighter Group. He arrived in Australia to find a situation far different from the clean training bases of the States. Airfields were hacked out of the jungle. Heat, humidity and malaria were constant enemies. Japanese forces still threatened Port Moresby in New Guinea and the vital sea routes farther south. Many of the aircraft defending the region, P-39 Airacobras and P-40 Warhawks, were already struggling against nimble Japanese fighters and effective anti-aircraft guns. The 9th Fighter Squadron was slated to convert the scarce new P-38s, but deliveries were delayed. While they waited, Kenny didn't want his eager pilots sitting idle. In November 1942, Bong and several others were temporarily attached to the 39th Fighter Squadron of the 35th Fighter Group at Port Moresby. There, flying from rough strips with mountains on one side and the ocean on the other, they would get their first taste of combat. On December 27, 1942, just after Christmas, Bong finally got what he'd been training for. A formation of Japanese aircraft dive bombers with fighter escort approached Allied positions near Buna, where Australian and American troops were locked in a brutal struggle to dislodge Japanese forces dug into the coastal jungle. Bong and his comrades intercepted. Accounts differ slightly on the exact mix of enemy types, but what is clear is that in the chaos of the engagement, he shot down 2 aircraft, typically identified as a Mitsubishi A6M0 and a Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar, or a Valdive bomber and a Zero. He brought his P-38 back to Port Moresby with gun barrels warm and a new understanding of what air combat really meant. The sudden appearance of enemy shapes, the need to make split-second decisions, the strange quiet afterward when the radio chatter dies down and the jungle slips back under the wings. For those 2 victories over Buna, he received the Silver Star. More importantly, the farm boy from Wisconsin had become a combat pilot with blood in the game. The next week showed that his success wasn't a fluke. On January 7th, 1943, he downed 2 Oscars over Lae. The very next day he claimed another enemy aircraft near Lae Harbor, giving him 5 confirmed Victories A status in barely 2 weeks of real combat. Fellow pilots noticed that there was nothing theatrical about the way Bong reacted to his rapid rise. He didn't swagger around the mess tent or talk endlessly about his kills. He stayed the same quiet, friendly man they had known in training. someone who would help patch up a leaky tent or trade his turn at the shower line without a second thought. What changed was the way people looked at him. The squadron now had an ace, and aces carried weight in a war where morale could be as fragile as the thin aluminum skins of their aircraft. New Guinea in 1943 was one of the most inhospitable battlefields of the war. Pilots flew long missions over mountains and jungle with few landmarks and unreliable weather forecasts. A sudden cloud bank could hide a ridge until the last moment. An engine problem might mean bailing out into trackless rainforest where rescue was uncertain. Malaria, dysentery, and heat exhaustion did almost as much damage as enemy fire. Yet for Bong, this harsh environment also offered opportunity. The Japanese needed to move men and supplies along the northern coast of New Guinea and toward Rabaul, their major base in the region. Allied air power aimed to cut those lifelines. In March 1943, he took part in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, a crucial engagement in which Allied bombers and fighters attacked a Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce Leh. Over several days, waves of B-25s, B-17s, and bow fighters, escorted by fighters like the P-38, smashed the convoy, sinking most of the transports and many of the escorts. Bong added to his score, downing at least one Japanese aircraft during the battle, and later describing the action as one of the most decisive he had seen in the theatre. Through the spring and early summer his tally grew steadily. He downed reconnaissance aircraft, bombers and fighters in a series of engagements over New Guinea and nearby seas. On March 11th he claimed 2 more zeros. On March 29th he destroyed a fast Ki-46 Dyna reconnaissance plane, a valuable target because such aircraft directed Japanese operations. In April he shot down a Betty bomber over Milne Bay, earning an air medal. By mid-1943 his reputation within the 5th Air Force was well established. Pilots liked flying with him because he was aggressive but not suicidal. He didn't throw his wingmen into hopeless situations or chase kills at the expense of mutual support. When he went in for a firing pass, he closed to short range, using the concentrated firepower of the P-38's nose guns to finish the job instead of spraying from a distance. That habit getting close enough to fill the windscreen with the enemy before firing would be one of the reasons he so rarely wasted ammunition. On July 26, 1943, he had the kind of day that cements a legend. Flying escort for bombers near Leh, he engaged a formation of Japanese fighters and over the course of the running battle shot down 4. 2 days later he added a 5th, bringing his total to at least 16 victories. For the July 26th action he received the Distinguished Service Cross, the US Army's second highest award for valor. By late 1943, Bong was more than just an ace, he was becoming a symbol. Back home, American newspapers and radio programs were hungry for heroes from the Pacific, where early defeats in the Philippines and elsewhere had left the public anxious. A modest, smiling farm boy who racked up victories in a futuristic twin-engined fighter was perfect. The name Dick Bong began appearing in headlines, usually followed by phrases like Ace of the Southwest Pacific or Farmlad Down's Another Zero. His commanders understood the value of such a figure. Morale was a weapon, and aces could inspire not just pilots but ground crews, infantrymen and civilians. But they also understood something else. Pilots do not stay lucky forever. Every mission was a roll of the dice. No matter how skilled, an ace could be lost to a lucky burst from a bomber's tail guns, a mid-air collision, or a sudden engine failure over hostile territory. Late that year, after nearly a year of near-continuous operations, Bong finally rotated home for leave in the United States. He was thin from tropical service but otherwise looked much as he had when he left, except that he now carried the quiet weight of someone who had seen friends fail to return from missions. The Army and the War Department had plans for him. America's growing Air Force needed war bond sales, recruiting posters, and proof that its young men were beating the enemy. Bong toured training bases and cities, met politicians and reporters, and did the sort of public relations work that makes a war feel real and winnable to people thousands of miles from the front. It was necessary, but he later admitted that endless speeches and handshakes felt almost more exhausting than combat. Yet the war was far from over, and the Southwest Pacific still needed experienced pilots. In early 1944, with his victory tally in the mid-20s, Bong would be on his way back to the theatre and toward the paradox that gives this story its title. The ace ordered to be a teacher, an observer, a symbol in photographs, who could not stop destroying enemy planes when they appeared in his gun sight. In November 1943, while home in Wisconsin, he met a dark-haired college student and part-time model named Marge Vetendahl at a homecoming event. Friends remembered that the shy farm boy who could face a sky full of enemy fighters without blinking suddenly became tongue-tied. He spent the rest of his leave trying to see her whenever he could, then promised that he would come back after the war and marry her. When he returned to the Southwest Pacific in early 1944, he carried photographs of Marge in his kit. As soon as he was assigned another P-38, he had her portrait painted on the nose, with her first name in big cursive letters beneath it. From then on, his lightning wasn't just a serial number, it was Marge, and every time he walked out to the revetment and saw her face on the aluminum skin, it was a reminder of what he was fighting to get back to. By this stage of the war, the Allied offensive in New Guinea had shifted from desperate defence to a steady, grinding advance. American, Australian and Dutch forces were leapfrogging westward along the island's north coast, capturing airfields at places like Lae, Nadzab, Sidor, and eventually Hollandia to isolate Japanese strongholds and cut off their supply lines. Each captured strip became a new springboard for the 5th Air Force's fighters and bombers, pushing Japanese air power farther back toward the Philippines and the vital oil fields of the Netherlands East Indies. Bong's experience made him a natural fit for this phase of the campaign. He knew the weather, the terrain, the way Japanese pilots liked to set up their attacks. In February and March 1944, he flew a mix of escort and offensive sweeps, now with his familiar Marge artwork on the nose. He continued to apply the same simple rule that had kept him alive and racked up his score: close the distance until you can't miss. He wasn't exaggerating when he told friends that he didn't consider himself a particularly good shot. Official accounts and later interviews agree that Bong believed his gunnery was only average. To compensate, he drove his P-38 in dangerously close before squeezing the trigger, sometimes flying through pieces of the enemy aircraft as it disintegrated. That courage or recklessness, depending on your point of view, terrified squadron mates watching from a distance, but gave him a remarkable record of confirmed kills. On 12th April 1944, during raids against Japanese airfields around Hollandia in Dutch New Guinea, he added 3 more victories to his tally. These brought his total to at least 26, and by the time intelligence officers sorted out overlapping claims from that day, it was clear Captain Richard the Bong had just surpassed Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 credited victories. News of the new Ace of Aces raced back to the United States. Newspapers printed his photo, sometimes alongside Marge's, and stories emphasized the contrast between his deadly effectiveness in the air and his quiet, almost awkward personality on the ground. In the 5th Air Force, the announcement brought pride but also concern. Losing an ordinary fighter pilot was hard enough. Losing a national hero would be a propaganda disaster. General George Kenney decided that his top ace had done more than enough for one tour. In April, Bong was promoted to major and pulled out of combat. He was ordered back to the United States to visit General Hap Arnold, the commanding general of the Army Air Forces, and then to travel around training bases and war bond rallies. For a few months, the farm boy from Wisconsin became a celebrity. He met factory workers who had sons overseas and wanted to shake the hand of the man protecting them. He spoke at airfields full of cadets who stared at him wide-eyed, wondering if they'd ever manage even a fraction of his score. He even went through a formal course in advanced gunnery training he'd skipped the first time in his rush to get to combat so that he could teach others more systematically. Yet, for all the applause and parades, Bong was miserable away from the front. He missed his squadron. he missed his P-38. And, as the strategic direction of the war shifted, he knew that some of the most decisive battles in the Pacific were still ahead. By mid-1944, Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific had fought their way up the New Guinea coast as far as Biak and the nearby island of Nuumfor. These islands, with their airfields, were critical stepping stones toward the Philippines and the oil-rich regions of Borneo. At the same time, Admiral Nimitz's Central Pacific Drive was capturing the Marianas. MacArthur saw an opportunity. If the 5th Air Force could move forward to new bases, it could support an invasion of the Philippines in late 1944, fulfilling his famous promise, "I shall return." The air war in this region was changing too. Japanese air strength was declining, but their remaining pilots were experienced and often desperate. Many of the missions now involved long-range bomber strikes against heavily defended targets, oil refineries at Balikpapan in Borneo, shipping in the Makassar Strait, airfields that still housed dangerous fighter units. These were the kind of missions where a single escort fighter could make the difference between a bomber formation returning or being torn apart. Bong knew that if he stayed in the United States, he'd spend the rest of the war telling stories about past battles while other pilots fought the decisive ones. So he did what many frontline veterans did when they were rested for their own good. He asked to go back. Kenny hesitated. His ace had flown more than 200 missions and logged over 500 combat hours, but Kenny also believed in using his best people where they mattered most. Eventually he agreed, on one condition. Bong would not go back as an ordinary squadron pilot whose job was to hunt enemy aircraft. Instead, he would return as an advanced gunnery instructor and standardization officer on the staff of V Fighter Command. That job title sounds dry, but for Bong it meant a very specific set of instructions. When he arrived back in the Southwest Pacific around September 1944, reporting to Kenny at Hollandia, his orders were clear. He was allowed to fly on combat missions to observe tactics and evaluate gunnery, but he was not to go looking for dogfights. He was to defend himself and the bombers he escorted, collect gun camera film and practical lessons, then bring that knowledge back to the training huts and briefing tents. In other words, they wanted him in the air with a camera and a clipboard, not a personal scoreboard. On paper, it made perfect sense. Bong's experience could save far more lives if he used it to train dozens of younger pilots, instead of chasing a few more kills for himself. As standardization officer, he travelled between groups, sitting at rickety tables with squadron leaders to compare tactics, reviewing gun camera reels frame by frame, and drafting simple, practical bulletins. How to attack a Key 43 Oscar without overshooting. How to break up a tightly flown formation of Japanese twin-engine bombers. How to avoid the classic mistakes Western pilots made when turning with lightweight Japanese fighters. But once you strap into a P-38 and climb into a sky where people are trying to kill you, theory has a way of turning into action. By October 1944, Bong was operating primarily from Tacloban on Leyte, one of the first major islands in the Philippines to be invaded by Allied forces. The landings there on 20 October had triggered one of the largest naval battles in history and opened a new chapter of the air war. Japanese aircraft based on nearby islands and in the Netherlands East Indies desperately tried to attack the beachheads, supply convoys and airstrips. Every fighter in the 5th Air Force was needed to keep the pressure off the troops on the ground and the ships offshore. For Bong, his observer role quickly blurred into something more aggressive. Pilots who flew with him later recalled that he usually positioned himself where he could see the bombers and the enemy at the same time. He stayed disciplined at the start of an engagement, making sure the formations he was escorting remained covered. But if an enemy fighter slipped through and threatened the bombers, or if a Japanese formation began a diving attack on the American ships, he reacted instinctively. He went straight at them. The period between 10th October and 15th of November 1944 would become the most famous of his career and the heart of the paradox at the centre of this story. During those weeks, Bong flew repeated missions over some of the most heavily defended territory in the theatre. The Medal of Honor citation that would later be pinned to his chest summarized it in careful, formal language. Though assigned as a gunnery instructor, and neither required nor expected to perform combat duty, he voluntarily and at his own urgent request engaged in repeated combat missions, including unusually hazardous sorties over Balikpapan, Borneo, and in the later area of the Philippines. In those actions, his aggressiveness and daring resulted in the destruction of 8 enemy aircraft. Behind those dry words is a series of missions where a man told to just take photos, instead kept throwing himself into the fiercest part of the fight. On 10th October, Bong flew with a long-range strike whose target was the vital oil facilities around Balikpapan on the east coast of Borneo. These refineries were one of Japan's last major sources of aviation fuel, and the Imperial Japanese Navy defended them fiercely with anti-aircraft guns and fighters. As American bombers droned toward the target, their escorts high above, Bong scanned the upper and lower quadrants of the formation. When radar and visual observers reported incoming bandits, the sky around the armada erupted P-38s and other fighters rolling into intercepting arcs, Japanese twin-engine night fighters, and nimble Oscar fighters clawing upward to break into the bomber stream. According to post-war reconstructions and Bong's own combat report, he attacked one of the twin-engine interceptors, likely a Nakajima J-1N Irving, as it climbed toward the bombers. Closing in from behind and slightly above, he fired a short burst, saw strikes along the fuselage, and then pressed in closer for a second burst that sent the aircraft down in flames. Moments later, he spotted an Oscar cutting across the formation. Again he closed to near point-blank range before firing. The Japanese fighter flicked into a roll, trailed smoke and plunged out of the fight. Those 2 kills, 1 twin-engine fighter, 1 single-engine escort brought his official total to 30. For a man who'd been ordered not to seek combat, he was defending himself with remarkable efficiency. Over the next weeks, the pattern repeated. On 27th October, he downed another Oscar. The very next day, he added 2 more over the waters near Leyte, breaking up an attempted interception of American strike aircraft. On 10th November, he shot down yet another Oscar over Ormuk Bay, a key battleground where Japanese reinforcements were trying to reach Leyte by sea. The following day, he claimed 2 more enemy fighters. By mid-November, Bong's score had climbed to the mid-30s. He wasn't the only American ace operating in the region. Major Thomas Maguire of the 475th Fighter Group was rapidly adding to his own tally, and the friendly rivalry between the 2 men became a favourite subject for war correspondents. A famous photograph from this period shows the pair in discussion on a rough tropical airstrip. Bong in his V-Fighter command flight gear, technically a staff officer, Maguire in the line pilot's rougher kit. The caption notes that Bong, with his roving commission, wasn't tied to any single squadron, but his influence on tactics stretched across many. If you pause here for a moment, it's worth asking yourself what you would have done in his position. Imagine being told, in effect, you're too valuable to risk. Go along on missions, teach the younger pilots, bring back gun camera footage. Don't go looking for trouble. Then imagine watching Japanese fighters rolling in on bombers full of young crews who had never seen combat before. For Bong, the choice never really felt like a choice at all. His superiors could see the scoreboard climbing, and their concern grew with each mission. Kenny later wrote that he had hoped the instructor role would keep Bong out of the thickest fighting, but the young major kept volunteering for anything that looked dangerous. Kenny finally recommended him for the Medal of Honor for his actions between 10 October and 15 November 8, confirmed kills in barely more than a month, all achieved while technically serving on a training staff. On 12th of December 1944, on a muddy airstrip at Tacloban Leyte, General Douglas MacArthur himself pinned the pale blue ribbon and star of the Medal of Honor around Bong's neck. The citation read out loud the now famous words about his aggressiveness and daring, his voluntary participation in hazardous sorties, and the 8 enemy planes shot down during that period. Photographs from the ceremony show Bong standing stiffly at attention, MacArthur and Kenny beside him, the nose of a P-38 visible in the background. For a boy who'd grown up watching mail planes fly over his family's farm, it was an almost unimaginable moment. Most pilots who received the Medal of Honor were immediately pulled out of combat forever. In Bong's case, Kenny had already decided that enough was enough. But before he could be sent home for good, the 5th Air Force still needed every fighter it could get to cover the continuing operations in the Philippines. So Medal of Honor or not, Bong went back to flying. In early December, around the time of the ceremony, he continued escort and patrol missions over Leyte and neighbouring waters. On 7th December, while covering landings at Ormoc, an operation intended to cut off Japanese reinforcements, he shot down a Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bomber and a Nakajima Ki-44 Tojo fighter. These were the kind of mixed formations he'd warned younger pilots about. Heavy bombers with tough, fast escorts that couldn't be taken lightly. Once again, his method was the same. Hold his fire until he was close enough to see individual panels on the enemy aircraft, then fire a short, lethal burst from the P-38's concentrated nose guns. On 15th of December, he added another Oscar to his tally during operations supporting the landings on Mindoro, an island whose airfields would extend Allied fighter cover even farther toward Manila and Luzon. 2 days later came the mission that would seal his place in history. On 17th of December 1944, Major Richard Bong took off in a P-38, one of the newer L models, from an airfield in the Philippines to provide top cover near the town of San Jose on Mindoro. Japanese aircraft were still attempting to attack the new beachheads and airstrips, and American pilots had to be ready for sudden raids from any direction. Sometime during that patrol, radar or visual observers reported incoming enemy planes. As Bong and his wingmen moved to intercept, he spotted an Oscar angling in toward the Allied positions. Once again, he did exactly what he'd always done. He turned in, closed the distance until the green-brown camouflage of the Japanese fighter filled his gun sight, and fired. The Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, the light, agile Oscar that had been such a deadly opponent earlier in the war, burst into flame and went down. On the ground, intelligence officers tallied another confirmed victory. In the logbooks of the 5th Air Force, that Oscar became Bong's 40th official aerial kill. It had taken him just under 2 years from his first victories over Buna in December 1942 to that final engagement over Mindoro to shoot down 40 enemy aircraft. No American fighter pilot in any war has surpassed that record. For Kenny, the number wasn't a milestone, it was a red line. His ace had flown roughly 146 combat missions, logged more than 500 hours in combat conditions, and survived engagements that would have killed most other pilots several times over. The general decided that if Bong remained in the line any longer, sheer probability would eventually catch up with him. In January 1945, the order finally came down. The ace of aces was going home, this time for good. He left the Philippines not as the restless young captain who had once chafed at being pulled from combat, but as a major with the Medal of Honor on his chest, a chest full of other decorations, and a personal understanding of what it meant that so many of his friends hadn't made that final flight back to the States. Back in Wisconsin, he kept his promise. On 10th of February 1945, in a small ceremony attended by family and friends, Richard Bong married Marjorie Vattendahl. Photographs from that day show them smiling shyly, the top American ace of the war suddenly looking more nervous than he appeared in any cockpit photo. For a few brief months it seemed as if the story might end there. The farm boy turned fighter ace, home from the war with a chest full of medals and a new bride. But the United States Army Air Forces still had more work for its best pilots. The age of the propeller was ending, jets were coming, and they needed men who understood high-performance aircraft at the edge of their envelopes. Bong's next assignment would take him into that new world and toward the final tragic twist in a life that had already defied so many expectations. The United States Army Air Forces still had more work for its best pilots, but the nature of that work was changing. Across the world, engineers were already building and flying machines that looked and sounded unlike anything that had fought over New Guinea or the Philippines. Germany had fielded the Me-262, the first operational jet fighter. Britain's Gloucester Meteor was intercepting V-1 flying bombs over southern England. The US Army Air Forces, determined not to be left behind in the post-war world, was rushing its own jet program forward, the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star. The Shooting Star was a very different creature from the P-38. Designed by a Lockheed team under Clarence Kelly Johnson, it had a single fuselage, a straight wing, and a single turbojet engine buried in the centre of the fuselage, drinking fuel at a rate that would have horrified any P-38 crew chief. In level flight, it could approach 500 miles per hour, faster than any Allied propeller fighter, and in a dive it entered regimes of speed where compressibility and control stiffness were still poorly understood. The Army needed acceptance test pilots to take each new jet off the Lockheed flight line, run it through a short test profile, and sign off that it was airworthy before it went to operational units. These pilots had to be both experienced and calm. A jet that developed a problem close to the ground left very little time to think. That was the job Richard Bong received after his wedding. In early 1945, following a brief honeymoon with Marge in California, Major Bong reported to the Lockheed plant at Burbank as an Army Air Forces acceptance pilot. His task sounded almost modest compared to the chaos of the Philippines. Take brand new P-80As up from the Lockheed Air Terminal, climb to altitude, check engine performance, controls and basic systems, then bring them back for any necessary adjustments. Each flight was relatively short, usually 15 to 20 minutes. For the first time in years, his missions had nothing to do with enemy aircraft. There were no Oscars or Zeros waiting above the clouds, no jungle-shrouded mountains to clear on the way home. Instead, there were engineers with clipboards, mechanics with wrenches, and a plane that represented the future of air combat. If there was any lingering thought that he might return to combat flying, the Army Air Forces put it to rest. Bong had already flown 146 combat missions and logged around 500 hours in combat, depending on the source. His record of 40 confirmed aerial victories was locked into history. Kenny and Arnold both wanted him alive to tell the story, to help guide the next generation of pilots into the jet age. In some ways, the assignment suited him. He had always been a hands-on flyer, interested not just in tactics, but in how an aircraft behaved at the edge of its envelope. Now he could explore an entirely new type of machine without anyone shooting back. But the reality of jet test work in 1945 was that the machines themselves were dangerous. P-80s were still early in their development. Engines were temperamental, systems failed without warning, and the procedures for dealing with malfunctions were evolving from one week to the next. Bong approached the new aircraft with the same combination of humility and quiet confidence that had marked his earliest days with the P-38. He did not pretend to be an instant expert on jets. He studied the manuals, listened to Lockheed's company test pilots, and worked his way up gradually through speeds and maneuvers. By early August, he had flown the Shooting Star only a dozen times, for a total of about 4 hours and 15 minutes. In combat terms, it was the equivalent of a few short patrols, not nearly enough to feel as comfortable as he had in his old twin-boom Lightning. The acceptance flights followed a standard pattern. The pilot would start the engine on the ramp, taxi out on the concrete of the Lockheed Air Terminal, line up on the runway and take off with full power. After climbing to a safe altitude, he would test various throttle settings, check fuel flow, trim and control response, and sometimes perform gentle aerobatics. If everything looked good, he'd bring the aircraft back down, write up any small discrepancies for the mechanics, and repeat the process with the next jet. On the ground, life looked almost normal. Bong and Marge rented a small place in the Los Angeles area, often visiting with fellow pilots and Lockheed employees. People recognized him on the street occasionally. Newspaper and newsreel stories had made his face familiar. Yet the war still raged across the Pacific, and the couple knew that even if Dick wasn't in combat anymore, Friends they'd left behind were still facing kamikaze attacks and fierce resistance on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Then came August 6, 1945. That morning, half a world away, a B-29 named Enola Gay took off from Tinian Island, carrying the first atomic bomb ever used in war, destined for Hiroshima. In California, the day began like any other for the test pilots at Burbank. There were aircraft to check, forms to sign, and acceptance flights to schedule. Sometime early that afternoon, Major Bong strapped into a brand new P-80A 1LO, Army serial number 44485348, for another routine acceptance flight. The weather over the San Fernando Valley was clear. Ground crewmen helped him into the cockpit, secured the harness, and made sure the canopy mechanisms worked. The Shooting Star's single General Electric turbojet, mounted low in the fuselage, lit with a roar and a rush of hot air out the tailpipe. At about 2:20 p.m, the jet rolled onto the runway at the Lockheed Air Terminal and accelerated. Witnesses later recalled the smooth takeoff and initial climb. Everything looked normal until it didn't. Roughly 2,700 feet down the runway, and about 150 feet in the air, observers saw a puff of white smoke behind the aircraft. The P-80 continued climbing for another half mile, but something was clearly wrong. Investigators later concluded that the main fuel pump had failed shortly after takeoff, starving the engine. The aircraft was equipped with an auxiliary fuel pump known as the I-16 pump that could keep the engine running if the primary system failed, but for reasons that would never be completely clear, Bong did not switch it on in time. Some pilots who flew with him speculated that he may have simply forgotten the new procedure in the stress of sudden power loss so close to the ground. Others suggested that the fault may have been more complicated than the official reports indicated, or that Bong was already busy struggling to keep the jet under control as the engine flamed out. His brother Carl, who later wrote a detailed biography drawing on crash reports and witness statements, questioned whether a pilot as meticulous as Dick would have repeated a known oversight. What is certain is that, as the jet's engine faltered, Bong made the only choice left to him. The canopy came off, either blown by an explosive charge or released manually, and he attempted to bail out. Eyewitnesses saw the small figure leave the cockpit and begin to separate from the aircraft. Seconds later, the P-80 rolled sharply, its right wing dropping, and then nosed over toward the ground. There was almost no altitude left. The jet struck a narrow field near the intersection of Oxnard Street and Satsuma Avenue in North Hollywood and exploded. Bong's parachute never had time to open. He was killed instantly. He was 24 years old. Fire crews and military personnel rushed to the crash site, but there was nothing they could do. Reporters heard the news within hours. By the next morning, newspapers across the United States carried a grim headline somewhere near an even larger one: the destruction of Hiroshima by a single bomb. Jet plane explosion kills Major Bong, top U.S. ace, read the New York Times. Similar phrases appeared on front pages in Washington, Los Angeles, and dozens of other cities. For people who had followed his career, the shock was profound. The ace of aces, who had survived years of combat over jungles and oceans, had died not in a dogfight, but in a test flight over California farmland. The military held a funeral service in California, then returned his body to Wisconsin. He was buried in Poplar, not far from the fields where he had watched mail planes as a boy. Marge, widowed only 6 months after her wedding day, eventually rebuilt her life modelling, acting in small roles, later in marriage, but she never forgot the young major whose face had once looked out from the nose of a P-38 nicknamed for her. In the decades that followed, Richard Bong's name would be attached to bridges, parks, airports, and museums. The planned Bong Air Force Base in Wisconsin was never completed, but the land became the Richard Bong State Recreation Area. A major bridge connecting Duluth, Minnesota and Superior, Wisconsin, carries his name, as does the small airport in Superior. The Richard Thwa Bong Veterans Historical Center in Superior preserves his letters, photographs and artifacts, including a restored P-38 painted to represent Marge, so that new generations can see what the aircraft looked like that carried him into history. Historians and fellow pilots have spent years analysing his record. Some point out that the way victories were counted in the Southwest Pacific, where pilots often flew long, exhausting missions with few witnesses, means he may have had more than 40 actual kills. Kenny himself believed that Bong had given away several victories to wingmen whose confidence he wanted to build. Others emphasise that raw numbers, while impressive, don't fully explain his significance. Many pilots shot down enemy aircraft. What set Bong apart was the combination of skill, discipline, and quiet humanity he showed while doing it. He wasn't a loud, charismatic squadron leader in the cinematic sense. He was the man who helped ground crews with their work, who treated younger pilots kindly, who wrote home to his parents as "Dear Mom and Dad," even when his letters contained brief, carefully coded mentions of dangerous missions. For historians trying to understand why his story still matters, two themes stand out. The first is the way his life illustrates the brutal efficiency of the air war in the Pacific. The Southwest Pacific area was not a glamorous front. It lacked the sweeping dogfights over Europe that made headlines. Instead, it offered long, sweaty flights over jungle and water, sudden bursts of deadly combat, and the constant threat of disease and weather. Yet it was there that the US Army Air Forces learned how to combine long-range fighters, medium and heavy bombers, and naval support to isolate Japanese strongholds and slowly strangle their supply lines. Bong's 40 victories were part of that larger strategic picture, one reliable P-38 at a time preventing enemy bombers and fighters from striking Allied troops and convoys. The second theme is the tension embodied in the title of this story. They ordered him to just take photos, but he destroyed 40 enemy planes instead. Twice in his short career, higher command tried to shield him from the full danger of combat by giving him roles that were technically non-offensive. First as an advanced gunnery instructor in the Southwest Pacific, told he could fly on missions but should focus on training and observation. Later as an acceptance test pilot in California, tasked with evaluating jets rather than facing enemy aircraft. In the Philippines, those orders lasted only until the first enemy formation appeared. Bong's instinct, drilled into him by years of flying fighters and reinforced by loyalty to the crews he escorted, would not let him watch passively while enemy aircraft dove toward American bombers or ships. He attacked again and again, adding 8 victories during the very period when he was not supposed to be seeking combat at all. The Medal of Honor citation, written in measured bureaucratic language, quietly acknowledges this by emphasizing that he flew those missions voluntarily and neither required nor expected to perform combat duty. In California, the same sense of duty expressed itself in a different way. There, the men he was trying to protect were not bomber crews, but the future pilots who would fly the Shooting Star in service. Every acceptance flight he completed safely meant another aircraft delivered to an operational unit with confidence that it could be trusted, and every anomaly he discovered might save a less experienced pilot's life later. The cruel irony is that the only mission that finally killed him was one of those safeguard flights. The sky over North Hollywood on August 6, 1945, held no enemy fighters. Yet the combination of a mechanical failure and human fallibility proved as lethal as any Japanese bullet. When you look at his life in sequence, the 40 victories almost feel like an unintended consequence of something deeper. Richard Bong was not hunting numbers. He was doing a job as well as he knew how. Whether that job was escorting a formation, teaching younger pilots, or wringing out a prototype jet so others could fly it with confidence. For viewers today, especially those used to seeing air combat through the lens of movies and video games, it's easy to get lost in the statistics. 40 kills, 146 missions, 500 combat hours. But behind each of those numbers is a sequence of very human decisions: when to press an attack and when to break away, how close to get before firing, whether to risk your own life to protect someone else's. The boy from Poplar who once watched mail planes over dairy fields ended up making those decisions in a sky halfway around the world, strapped into an aircraft that would have seemed like science fiction when he was a child. He died before he could see the war he fought in come to a close, before he could grow old with the woman whose portrait adorned his Lightning's nose. And yet, in a way, his story did exactly what he might have hoped it would do. It helped others survive. The pilots he trained used his lessons in dozens of late-war engagements. The engineers who studied his P-38 tactics and his P-80 flights improved aircraft and procedures for those who followed. The generations who came after, reading his letters or walking past his restored fighter in a museum hangar, learned something about courage that isn't flashy or theatrical. The courage to keep doing a dangerous job carefully day after day for reasons bigger than yourself. So when you hear the phrase, they ordered him to just take photos, he destroyed 40 enemy planes instead, it's not just a dramatic tagline, it's a summary of a deeper truth. Richard Ira Bong was twice given roles meant to keep him away from the front line. Both times, he turned those roles into opportunities to protect others by teaching, by observing, and, when necessary, by fighting. 40 enemy planes fell to his guns. Countless Allied airmen came home because those enemy fighters didn't. And somewhere above the jungles of New Guinea or the bays of the Philippines, if you could freeze a single moment of a P-38 closing in for a point-blank burst, you would see not a scorekeeper chasing numbers, but a quiet farm boy doing the one thing he knew how to do better than almost anyone else in the world.